Hello, and welcome back to the Sleep Lab. Tonight's title is a little provocative, and it's worth being honest about that before we go any further. Mind control is not really what tonight's episode is about, not in the way old films and paranoid conspiracy stories once imagined it. There is no science tonight about controlling another person against their will, planting secret commands, or overriding anyone's free will while they sleep. What we are actually going to explore tonight is something far more interesting, and considerably more real: the genuine, well-documented science of how a sleeping brain can still be gently influenced, shaped, and strengthened by carefully timed information, sound, and suggestion, and why so many popular claims about this exact subject, dating back nearly a century, turned out to be almost entirely false. This is a story with real science and real pseudoscience tangled together, and tonight we're going to carefully separate the two, so that by the end of this episode you'll understand not just what a sleeping mind can genuinely be nudged to do, but also which of the popular claims about mind control while you sleep you can safely, calmly set aside as myth. It's worth being clear, before we begin, about why this particular topic tends to attract so much confident misinformation compared to many other areas of sleep science. The idea of a hidden, powerful influence acting on us without our knowledge or consent taps into something deep and old in the human imagination, a fear considerably older than sleep science itself, showing up across centuries of folklore, religious anxiety about possession, and later, 20th century paranoia about propaganda, advertising, and covert government experimentation. Sleep, being the one part of daily life where a person is genuinely, undeniably unconscious and vulnerable, has always offered a particularly compelling stage for these older fears to attach themselves to. Understanding the real, carefully documented science tonight isn't really about deflating something mysterious and exciting into something boring. It's about replacing an old, imprecise fear with something considerably more interesting: a genuinely nuanced, evidence-based picture of a sleeping mind that is neither a helpless blank page nor an impenetrable fortress, but something quieter, more selective, and in its own way, more remarkable than either extreme. None of this requires you to do anything except listen and rest. If tonight's exploration is worth your time, a like, a subscribe, or a thought left below helps this small lab keep its lights on for other sleepy minds finding their way here. But for now, there is nothing left to do but settle in, let your body grow heavy, and let your sleeping brain do exactly what it already knows how to do best. Let's begin. Long before modern neuroscience had the tools to properly study sleep, an entire industry sprang up around the seductive idea that a person could learn while unconscious, absorbing new information, new languages, even new personality traits, simply by playing recordings through a speaker beside the bed all night long. This idea, technically called Hypnopedia, exploded in popularity throughout the mid-20th century, particularly across the 1950s and 1960s, with companies selling record players, cassette systems, and eventually specialized pillow speakers specifically marketed for sleep learning, promising customers everything from foreign language fluency to improved memory to entirely reshaped self-confidence, all supposedly absorbed effortlessly overnight while the customers simply lay there sleeping. The concept captured public imagination so thoroughly that it appeared in popular fiction throughout the era, including Aldous Huxley's famous 1932 novel Brave New World, which depicted an entire society whose children were conditioned through relentless nighttime repetition of ideological phrases played while they slept. When actual sleep researchers finally began testing these claims rigorously in controlled laboratory conditions, using proper electroencephalography to confirm participants were genuinely, fully asleep rather than drowsy or briefly awake, the results were consistently, disappointingly negative. A landmark 1956 study conducted by researchers Charles Simon and William Emmons at the University of Chicago found that information played during confirmed, verified sleep produced essentially no measurable learning at all, and that any apparent successes reported in earlier, less rigorous sleep learning research could almost always be explained by participants who had briefly, unknowingly woken during the recordings, absorbing the material during those unnoticed micro-awakenings rather than during genuine, deep, unconscious sleep. This finding effectively dismantled the entire commercial premise behind decades of sleep learning products, revealing that what customers had actually been paying for was, in most documented cases, simply the illusion of learning while asleep, built on recordings that were, in reality, only ever being absorbed during moments the sleeper wasn't genuinely asleep at all. Despite this thorough scientific debunking, the sleep learning industry didn't disappear quietly, and its persistence offers an interesting case study in how appealing an idea can remain even after the evidence against it becomes overwhelming. Manufacturers of these products continued marketing pillow speakers and sleep learning cassette systems well into the 1970s and beyond, often citing the same handful of earlier, methodologically flawed studies while quietly ignoring or downplaying the more rigorous negative findings that had since accumulated. Some products shifted their marketing language subtly over time, moving away from claims of learning entirely new material toward vaguer promises about reinforcing confidence or motivation, a shift that, as we'll see later in tonight's episode, may have accidentally stumbled closer to something with genuine scientific support than the original, more dramatic sleep learning claims ever were. This pattern, where a scientifically debunked idea persists commercially simply by softening its claims just enough to survive public scrutiny while retaining its emotionally appealing core promise, is one sleep researchers and skeptics of pseudoscience have observed repeatedly across many decades of health and wellness marketing, extending well beyond sleep learning alone. To understand exactly why the classic sleep learning fad failed so consistently under proper scientific scrutiny, it helps to understand what a sleeping brain is actually doing, structurally and chemically, compared to a waking one. Learning complex new information, whether a foreign vocabulary word, a mathematical concept, or an unfamiliar fact, requires active engagement from the brain's prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for focused attention, conscious reasoning, and the deliberate encoding of new memories into a form the brain can later retrieve. During deep, slow-wave sleep, the stage most associated with the body's most restorative physical processes, activity in the prefrontal cortex drops substantially, and the brain's overall processing shifts toward internal maintenance functions rather than the kind of active, externally focused attention genuine learning requires. Beyond reduced prefrontal activity, sleep researchers have also identified specific neurochemical conditions during deep sleep that appear actively unfavorable to forming new, complex memories, including notably reduced levels of acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter known to play an essential role in attention and the encoding of new information while awake. Some researchers have proposed that this chemical environment during deep sleep isn't simply a passive, incidental obstacle to learning, but may actually serve a deliberate, protective function, helping ensure the fragile process of memory consolidation, transferring recently learned daytime information from short-term to long-term storage, can proceed without being disrupted or overwritten by an influx of brand new, competing information arriving from the external environment while that delicate consolidation work is still underway. In other words, far from being an unfortunate biological oversight that sleep learning products might someday cleverly work around, the sleeping brain's resistance to absorbing genuinely new, complex information may actually be a feature rather than a flaw, protecting the very memory consolidation process that makes sleep so valuable for learning in the first place. This protective framing has gained additional support from research into a specific category of sleep disruption called sleep fragmentation, in which a person's sleep is repeatedly interrupted by brief arousals throughout the night, even without the person fully waking or being consciously aware the interruptions occurred at all. Studies comparing memory consolidation in people experiencing fragmented sleep against those experiencing genuinely continuous, undisturbed sleep have consistently found that fragmentation measurably impairs next-day memory performance, even when total sleep duration remains essentially identical between the two groups. This finding reinforces the broader picture emerging from tonight's exploration so far. The sleeping brain isn't simply passively resting while memory consolidation happens automatically in the background regardless of circumstances, but is instead engaged in an active, delicate process that genuinely requires a kind of internal, protected stability to complete successfully, a stability that both genuinely new external information and even brief, unnoticed interruptions appear capable of disrupting in measurable, scientifically documented ways. This same protective framing has practical relevance well beyond questions of sleep learning, connecting directly to broader public health guidance about sleep environment more generally. Sleep researchers studying environmental noise have found that even sounds too quiet or brief to cause a full, remembered awakening can still measurably fragment sleep architecture and impair next-day memory consolidation, which is part of why sleep hygiene guidance consistently emphasizes minimizing environmental noise and light disruption throughout the night, not merely to help a person fall asleep more easily, but specifically to protect the delicate, ongoing consolidation work happening throughout every stage of a genuinely undisturbed night. Understanding sleep as an active, working process rather than simple, passive rest reframes many familiar pieces of sleep advice in a considerably more meaningful light, transforming recommendations like keeping a bedroom cool, dark, and quiet from generic comfort suggestions into genuinely protective measures for a specific, ongoing cognitive process your brain is quietly performing every single night, whether or not you're aware of it happening. While the classic dream of learning brand new information while asleep turned out to be almost entirely mythical, modern sleep researchers have discovered something genuinely real and scientifically fascinating hiding in a closely related corner of the same general idea, a technique called targeted memory reactivation, often abbreviated as TMR. Rather than attempting to teach the sleeping brain something entirely new, TMR works by re-exposing a sleeping brain to a specific cue, most commonly a particular sound or scent, that was deliberately paired with a piece of information the person had already actively, consciously learned earlier while fully awake. In a landmark study published in 2007 by researchers Bjorn Rasch and colleagues, participants learned the locations of various card pairs in a memory game while a specific, distinctive scent, in this case the smell of roses, was present in the room throughout the entire learning session. That night, some participants were re-exposed to the same rose scent specifically during their deep, slow-wave sleep, while others were not. The following morning, participants who had received the scent cue during deep sleep showed significantly better recall of the card locations than those who had not, demonstrating that a sleeping brain, while genuinely unable to absorb brand new complex information, remains capable of something remarkably different and genuinely useful, strengthening and reinforcing memories that had already been established through active, conscious learning beforehand. This distinction between learning something new during sleep, which the evidence strongly suggests simply doesn't work, and reinforcing something already learned while awake, which a growing body of careful research increasingly supports, represents one of the most important and frequently overlooked corrections separating genuine modern sleep science from the popular sleep learning mythology that preceded it by decades. Subsequent research building on Rash's original 2007 study has extended these findings considerably, replicating and refining the core effect across a range of different memory types and experimental conditions. Researchers have found that TMR effects appear specifically tied to slow-wave sleep in particular, with cueing delivered during REM sleep or lighter stages of non-REM sleep generally failing to produce the same measurable memory benefit, suggesting the effect depends on very specific underlying neural mechanisms unique to deep sleep's particular pattern of brain activity. Other studies have found that TMR can strengthen not just simple spatial memories like the card matching task in the original study, but also more complex forms of learning, including foreign language vocabulary that had already been actively studied while awake, and even certain motor skills, like sequences of finger movements practiced during a waking training session. What unites all of these successful applications is the same essential requirement established early in this line of research: the information being reinforced must already exist as a genuine memory trace formed through active, conscious learning beforehand, with sleep cueing serving only to strengthen and consolidate that pre-existing trace rather than creating anything new from nothing at all. Building directly on the discovery of targeted memory reactivation, researchers have gone on to develop increasingly sophisticated techniques using carefully timed sounds, rather than scents, to reinforce specific memories during sleep, taking advantage of sounds considerably faster, more precise timing compared to scent, which tends to linger and disperse more slowly through a room. In several notable studies, researchers have paired specific, distinctive sounds with particular items during a waking learning session, whether vocabulary words, the locations of objects on a screen, or even specific motor skills like a sequence of finger movements, and then played those same associated sounds again during confirmed slow-wave sleep later that same night, carefully timed to coincide with specific phases of the brain's naturally occurring slow oscillations, the large, rhythmic waves of electrical activity that characterize the deepest stage of non-REM sleep. Researchers studying this technique have found that memory improvement appears to depend significantly on precise timing relative to these slow oscillations, with cues delivered during the up phase of a slow oscillation, when cortical neurons are in a more excitable state, producing measurably better memory reinforcement than cues delivered during the down phase, when neurons are comparatively less responsive. This precise timing dependency reveals something genuinely important about how the sleeping brain processes these reinforcement cues, suggesting the effect isn't simply a matter of playing a sound loudly enough or often enough throughout the night, but depends on delivering that sound during a very specific, narrow window of heightened neural receptivity that recurs rhythmically, roughly once per second, throughout deep slow-wave sleep. Researchers in this field have used this precise timing knowledge to develop specialized equipment capable of monitoring a sleeping participant's brainwaves in real time and delivering cues automatically, synchronized precisely to these naturally occurring windows of opportunity, a level of technical sophistication considerably beyond anything imagined by the pillow speaker sleep learning products of the mid-20th century. This precise timing requirement also explains why attempts to replicate TMR benefits using simple consumer sleep tracking apps and generic overnight audio playlists, of the kind now widely available commercially, have generally failed to demonstrate anything close to the effect sizes seen in properly controlled laboratory research. Genuine TMR studies rely on real-time electroencephalography monitoring, allowing researchers to identify a participant's specific slow oscillation phases as they occur and deliver cues within a precisely calibrated window measured in mere milliseconds, a level of monitoring and timing precision that consumer-grade sleep trackers, which typically rely on far cruder movement or heart rate-based estimates of sleep stage rather than direct brainwave measurement, simply cannot achieve. This distinction matters considerably for anyone encountering commercial products that invoke TMR research to market simple, untimed overnight audio playback, since the actual published science supporting genuine memory benefits depends specifically on a level of precise, brainwave synchronized timing that most currently available consumer sleep technology has not yet demonstrated it can reliably replicate outside a proper research laboratory setting. Researchers have also explored a genuinely elegant variant of this technique called closed-loop auditory stimulation, which goes a step further than simply reinforcing previously learned memories by attempting to actively enhance the slow oscillations of deep sleep themselves, rather than merely timing cues to coincide with oscillations already naturally occurring. In this approach, researchers deliver brief, precisely timed pink noise or click sounds specifically synchronized to amplify a sleeper's own ongoing slow oscillations, essentially giving each individual brainwave a small, precisely timed acoustic push at exactly the right moment to make it slightly larger and more pronounced than it would have been naturally. Studies using this closed-loop approach have found it can measurably increase the depth and continuity of slow-wave sleep itself, and, intriguingly, this enhancement alone, independent of any specific memory-related cueing, appears associated with modest improvements in next-day memory performance, suggesting that beyond the more targeted memory reinforcement possible through TMR specifically, there may be genuine potential in using carefully timed sound simply to help deep sleep itself become more robust and restorative, an active area of ongoing research with potential applications extending well beyond memory alone, into broader questions about sleep quality and its role in long-term brain health. Targeted memory reactivation research has extended beyond simple factual or spatial memory into some genuinely intriguing applications involving habit change and fear reduction, though this area of research carries important limitations worth understanding clearly. In a notable 2015 study led by researcher Katrina Honor, participants first underwent a conditioning procedure while awake, learning to associate two different odors with a mild electric shock, producing a measurable fear response specifically to those two scents. During subsequent slow-wave sleep, participants were then exposed to just one of the two previously fear-conditioned odors, without any accompanying shock. Upon waking, participants showed a measurably reduced fear response specifically to the odor that had been reintroduced during sleep, compared to the odor that had not been reintroduced, along with corresponding changes visible in brain activity associated with fear processing. This finding suggested that sleep might offer a genuine, if narrow, window for reinforcing the process of fear extinction, essentially helping consolidate the message that a previously threatening cue is now safe, without requiring the person to consciously, actively relive the fear-provoking association while awake. Similarly, other researchers have explored whether pairing an unpleasant smell, such as rotten eggs or fish, with the specific scent of cigarette smoke during sleep might help reduce smoking urges upon waking, with one notable 2020 study reporting modest but measurable reductions in cigarette consumption among smokers exposed to this pairing during sleep compared to a control group. It's important to add real, honest context to these promising but genuinely narrow findings. These studies involve carefully controlled laboratory conditions, relatively small numbers of participants, and effects that, while statistically measurable and scientifically meaningful, tend to be modest in size rather than dramatic, and none of this research suggests sleep alone can eliminate deeply ingrained habits or serious anxiety disorders without any accompanying conscious, waking effort. What this research genuinely demonstrates is something more modest but still remarkable. Sleep appears capable of gently reinforcing associations and emotional recalibrations that have already been meaningfully initiated while awake, rather than working as some kind of independent, standalone treatment capable of rewriting deep psychological patterns entirely on its own overnight. Researchers working in this specific area have also been careful to emphasize an important ethical dimension to fear-related and habit-related TMR research that distinguishes it clearly from any genuine mind control concern. Every documented study in this area has involved participants who consciously, willingly underwent the initial waking conditioning or learning phase, fully aware of what they were participating in and why, with the sleep-based cueing afterward serving only to reinforce an association or intention the participant had already knowingly, deliberately established themselves while fully conscious. There is no published, credible research suggesting sleep cues can implant an entirely new fear, habit, or aversion in a person without their prior conscious knowledge or participation, which represents an important, meaningful distinction from the fictional, dystopian mind control scenarios this general topic sometimes evokes. The genuine science here works with a person's own already established associations, gently reinforcing intentions and learning the person has already knowingly set in motion themselves, rather than covertly installing anything new without their awareness or consent. No discussion of mind control while you sleep would be complete without addressing subliminal messaging, the widely believed idea that hidden messages, flashed too briefly or played too quietly to be consciously perceived, can nonetheless slip past a person's awareness and directly influence their thoughts, purchases, or behavior, whether during sleep or simple ordinary wakefulness. This idea traces back to a now infamous 1957 claim by market researcher James Vickery, who announced that he had flashed the words "drink Coca-Cola and eat popcorn" for imperceptibly brief fractions of a second during a movie screening, supposedly causing a dramatic spike in concession stand sales. The claim generated enormous public alarm and fascination in equal measure, prompting government hearings and widespread public concern about hidden manipulation lurking throughout media and advertising. Years later, Vickery himself admitted the entire experiment had been fabricated, invented essentially as a publicity stunt for his struggling marketing consultancy, with no genuine study, no real data, and no actual movie theater experiment ever having taken place at all. Despite this thorough, well-documented debunking, the myth of powerful subliminal influence has proven remarkably resistant to correction, persisting for decades afterward in popular culture, urban legend, and, at various points, genuine public policy discussions. When researchers have subsequently conducted actual, rigorous experiments testing subliminal messaging under properly controlled laboratory conditions, the results have consistently shown that any genuine effects are, at most, extremely small, fleeting, and limited to very narrow, specific circumstances, falling dramatically short of the dramatic behavior-altering power popularly attributed to the concept. Some legitimate psychological research has found modest, short-lived subliminal priming effects under carefully controlled conditions, briefly nudging a person's response on an immediately following task in small, statistically measurable ways, but this genuine, narrow scientific finding bears little resemblance to the popular myth of subliminal messages secretly programming a person's deeper desires, purchasing decisions, or personality, whether delivered while awake or, especially, while genuinely, deeply asleep. The Vickery hoax's persistence in popular culture offers a genuinely interesting case study in how difficult a compelling, frightening myth can be to fully dislodge, even once thoroughly, publicly debunked by its own original source. Despite Vickery's own admission decades ago that no such experiment ever actually occurred, surveys conducted by psychologists studying public belief in subliminal messaging have repeatedly found that a substantial majority of the general public continues to believe subliminal advertising is both real and commonly used, decades after the definitive debunking became a matter of public record. Some researchers studying this persistent belief have suggested it may partly reflect a broader, deeply human discomfort with the idea that our own choices, purchases, and preferences are simply, mundanely our own, with the subliminal messaging myth offering a strangely more comfortable explanation for consumer behavior we might otherwise dislike or regret, one that locates responsibility in hidden external manipulation rather than in our own ordinary, sometimes flawed decision-making processes. Although the dramatic, mind-control version of subliminal influence turned out to be largely mythical, the underlying psychological phenomenon researchers call priming remains genuinely real, well-documented, and worth understanding on its own considerably more modest terms. Priming refers to the way exposure to one piece of information can subtly influence how quickly or in what particular way a person processes subsequent, related information, entirely without requiring the initial exposure to be hidden, subliminal, or delivered below the threshold of conscious awareness at all. A classic, frequently replicated example involves showing a person the word doctor, which measurably speeds up how quickly they can then recognize the related word nurse compared to an unrelated word, because activating one concept in memory appears to slightly, temporarily activate related concepts stored nearby within the same associative network. Priming effects like this are consistently reproducible under proper controlled conditions and represent a genuine, well-established feature of how human memory and cognition are organized and interconnected. Where priming research runs into serious trouble, and where a great deal of popular science reporting has historically overreached considerably, involves claims that priming can meaningfully influence complex, consequential behavior, such as purchasing decisions, voting choices, or broader personality traits, particularly through the kind of brief, subtle, or subliminal exposure popularly associated with mind control. Several prominent, widely publicized priming studies from the early 2000s claiming these kinds of dramatic behavioral effects have, in the years since, failed to replicate reliably when other independent research teams attempted to reproduce the original findings using larger sample sizes and more rigorous experimental controls, contributing significantly to what psychologists now openly call the replication crisis affecting several areas of experimental psychology. The genuine, well-supported version of priming remains real and scientifically interesting in its own right, but it is a considerably smaller, more modest, and more narrowly specific phenomenon than the popular mythology of hidden influence and mind control would ever lead a person to expect. The replication crisis touched on here deserves a bit more context, since it represents one of the more significant developments in psychological science over the past 2 decades and directly bears on how skeptically modern researchers now approach dramatic claims about hidden influence generally. Beginning around 2011, a series of large-scale, carefully coordinated efforts by independent research teams to replicate previously published, often widely cited psychology findings revealed that a substantial proportion, in some large replication projects roughly half or more, of these original studies failed to produce the same results when repeated under more rigorous conditions with larger sample sizes. Priming research in particular became one of the most prominent casualties of this broader reckoning, with several famous, widely taught priming studies from the 1990s and early 2000s, including some suggesting that subtle exposure to age-related words could measurably slow a person's walking speed, failing to replicate in subsequent, more carefully controlled attempts. This broader scientific reckoning has led to considerably more rigorous standards throughout experimental psychology generally, including larger required sample sizes, pre-registered experimental protocols designed to prevent researchers from unconsciously adjusting their analysis after seeing initial results, and a general cultural shift toward treating any single, dramatic finding with appropriate caution until independently replicated, a shift that has made the field's current, more modest understanding of priming considerably more trustworthy than the more dramatic, less rigorously tested claims that circulated widely in earlier decades. While a sleeping brain cannot learn genuinely new, complex information the way popular sleep learning mythology once promised, researchers have found that a sleeping brain remains far from completely disconnected from sounds occurring in its surrounding environment, processing auditory information in ways that are genuinely fascinating even without matching the dramatic claims of old sleep learning advertisements. Studies using electroencephalography have found that a sleeping brain continues registering and, to some meaningful degree, categorizing external sounds throughout the night, distinguishing, for instance, between a person's own name and other unfamiliar names, or between meaningful words and simple nonsense syllables, producing measurably different brain responses to each category even while the sleeper remains fully, genuinely unconscious and shows no outward behavioral sign of having noticed anything at all. This capacity appears to serve an important evolutionary function, allowing a sleeping brain to remain selectively alert to potentially important or threatening sounds in its environment, such as a baby's cry or an unfamiliar noise suggesting possible danger, without needing to fully wake for every single sound occurring nearby throughout the night. Researchers studying this phenomenon have also found that emotionally significant sounds, and sounds carrying personal relevance, such as a sleeper's own name spoken aloud, are more likely to trigger a genuine awakening compared to equally loud but personally irrelevant sounds, suggesting the sleeping brain performs a surprisingly sophisticated form of ongoing content evaluation even during deep, unconscious sleep. This selective processing capacity is part of what makes techniques like targeted memory reactivation genuinely plausible from a neuroscientific standpoint, since it confirms that a sleeping brain is not simply switched off to the external auditory world, but remains actively, if unconsciously, engaged with meaningful incoming sound in ways sophisticated enough to distinguish relevant cues from irrelevant background noise throughout the night. One particularly striking demonstration of this selective processing capacity comes from research on new parents, whose sleeping brains have been found to show measurably heightened sensitivity specifically to the sound of their own infant's cry compared to other, equally loud infant cries from unfamiliar babies, a distinction their sleeping brain appears able to draw automatically, without any conscious effort or deliberate listening involved. This kind of selective, meaning-based filtering during sleep also extends to studies of hospital and emergency workers, whose sleeping brains have similarly shown heightened responsiveness to alarm sounds and other work-relevant cues compared to control participants without the same professional exposure, suggesting the brain's sleeping filter for what counts as important enough to potentially warrant waking isn't fixed from birth, but can be shaped and calibrated over time by a person's particular life circumstances, responsibilities, and repeated real-world experience, adding yet another layer of genuine sophistication to what might otherwise seem, from the outside, like simple, undifferentiated unconsciousness. Separate from the question of whether information can be absorbed during actual sleep itself, researchers have found genuine, measurable value in what happens in the period immediately before sleep, a transitional state researchers call the hypnagogic period, when a person is drowsy, deeply relaxed, but not yet fully asleep. This particular window has been studied extensively in relation to self-hypnosis and guided relaxation techniques, revealing genuinely real, if again considerably more modest than popularly imagined, effects on subsequent thought patterns, mood, and even certain health outcomes. Clinical research into self-hypnosis techniques delivered specifically during this drowsy, pre-sleep window has found measurable benefits for conditions including chronic pain management, anxiety reduction, and improvements in sleep onset itself, findings robust enough that self-hypnosis and related relaxation techniques have found genuine, if adjunctive rather than standalone, use within several areas of clinical medicine. The mechanism researchers propose behind these genuine effects differs considerably from the popular mythology of mind control or subliminal programming. Rather than bypassing conscious awareness entirely to plant hidden directives, this pre-sleep window appears to represent a state of heightened suggestibility and reduced critical analytical filtering, meaning a person remains genuinely, consciously aware of the suggestions being offered, whether through their own internal self-talk or an external voice, but processes those suggestions with less of the skeptical, effortful scrutiny that fully alert, wide-awake thinking typically applies. This is a meaningfully different, and considerably more modest, phenomenon than secretly bypassing someone's awareness entirely, representing instead a genuine, well-documented window of heightened openness to consciously received, actively chosen suggestion, rather than any kind of covert influence operating entirely outside a person's own awareness or consent. Clinical hypnosis researchers have also worked to clarify a persistent public misconception closely related to this same territory. The popular image of hypnosis as a state in which a person's will is essentially suspended, leaving them entirely compliant and susceptible to any suggestion an operator chooses to offer. A portrayal reinforced for decades by stage hypnosis performances and dramatic fictional depictions. Actual clinical and experimental hypnosis research paints a considerably different, less dramatic picture, consistently finding that a hypnotized person retains their own underlying values, moral boundaries, and capacity for refusal throughout the hypnotic state, generally remaining unwilling to act against their own genuine ethical convictions even under formal hypnotic suggestion, and typically retaining full, conscious memory of the experience afterward unless specifically, cooperatively working with a practitioner toward a different therapeutic goal. This more accurate, evidence-based picture of hypnosis as a state of focused, cooperative attention rather than involuntary submission maps directly onto the broader pattern established throughout tonight's episode. The genuine, scientifically supported territory of suggestion and influence is consistently smaller, more collaborative, and more respectful of a person's underlying agency than popular imagination, shaped heavily by decades of dramatic fiction, has generally assumed. Given everything covered so far tonight, it's worth addressing directly one of the most commercially popular modern products built around the general idea of overnight mind influence: recorded sleep affirmations, audio tracks marketed with claims of reprogramming the subconscious mind, boosting self-esteem, or instilling positive beliefs while the listener sleeps, often layered with soft background music or nature sounds. Based on everything tonight's research has established, the specific marketing claim that these recordings work by being absorbed directly into the unconscious mind during genuine, deep sleep does not hold up particularly well against the same rigorous research that dismantled classic sleep learning claims decades earlier. However, this doesn't necessarily mean these recordings are entirely without any genuine value at all, simply that whatever benefit they offer likely operates through a different, more mundane mechanism than the one typically advertised. Listening to calm, positive, reassuring statements while lying in bed, during the drowsy, hypnagogic pre-sleep window discussed a moment ago, before genuine deep sleep actually begins, plausibly does engage the same kind of heightened, consciously experienced suggestibility associated with legitimate self-hypnosis research, offering real, if modest, potential benefit through mechanisms considerably more mundane than mysterious subconscious reprogramming during actual unconsciousness. Additionally, the simple, well-established relaxation response triggered by calm, soothing audio, entirely independent of the specific verbal content involved, has its own genuine, well-documented benefits for reducing pre-sleep anxiety and physiological arousal, potentially improving overall sleep quality regardless of whether any specific affirmation message is ever consciously or unconsciously absorbed and retained at all. In other words, these recordings may indeed offer real value to many listeners, but that value most likely comes from calm engagement during drowsy wakefulness and general relaxation benefits, rather than from any genuine mysterious programming occurring deep within actual, confirmed unconsciousness later in the night. There is also an interesting placebo-adjacent dimension worth mentioning honestly here, since it applies to a considerable amount of commercial sleep and wellness audio content generally. Researchers studying the placebo effect have found repeatedly that simply believing a particular intervention will help, entirely independent of whether the intervention's specific advertised mechanism is actually genuine or accurate, can itself produce real, measurable improvements in subjective experience, including reported sleep quality, anxiety levels, and general well-being, through psychological and physiological pathways distinct from whatever the product's marketing actually claims. This means a person who genuinely finds sleep affirmation recordings helpful is very likely experiencing something real, even if the specific mechanism advertised, unconscious overnight reprogramming, isn't the genuine explanation for why it's working. Sleep researchers studying this broader category of products generally encourage a kind of honest, clear-eyed appreciation for what these tools may actually be offering: calm engagement, ritual, and genuine relaxation benefit, rather than either dismissing them entirely as worthless or accepting the more dramatic marketing claims uncritically at face value. Given tonight's title, it would be an oversight not to address the genuinely real, if often exaggerated and sensationalized, historical intersection between sleep science and actual government research into influence and interrogation. During the Cold War era, the United States Central Intelligence Agency did, as a matter of documented, declassified historical record, fund, and conduct research broadly related to sleep deprivation, suggestibility, and psychological influence, most infamously through a covert program known as MKUltra, active primarily throughout the 1950s and 1960s. It's important to be precise and appropriately measured about what this documented historical program actually involved, since popular retellings have often blended genuine historical fact with considerably more exaggerated conspiracy theory. MKUltra research explored a wide range of psychological manipulation techniques, including sleep deprivation, sensory deprivation, and various drugs, most notably LSD, often administered to unwitting subjects without their knowledge or consent, representing a genuinely serious historical breach of research ethics that prompted significant congressional investigation once the program's existence was declassified and publicly revealed during the 1970s. However, the declassified historical record, including extensive congressional testimony and surviving program documentation, indicates that these efforts, despite substantial funding and years of dedicated experimentation, largely failed to produce anything resembling reliable, repeatable mind control in the dramatic, science fiction sense popularly associated with the program's name, with researchers involved in subsequent historical review generally concluding that the techniques tested proved inconsistent, unreliable, and far less powerful than the program's own researchers had originally hoped to achieve. This genuine historical episode offers an important, sobering real-world confirmation of much of what tonight's episode has already established through more conventional laboratory research, that even a well-funded, ethically unconstrained government program dedicated specifically to achieving genuine mind control over an extended period ultimately found the human mind, whether asleep, drugged, or otherwise altered, considerably more resistant to reliable manipulation than popular fear and speculation have long assumed. The eventual public exposure of MKUltra also had a genuinely significant, lasting positive consequence worth mentioning, since it directly contributed to major, lasting reforms in research ethics still in effect today. The congressional hearings and public outcry that followed the program's declassification in the mid-1970s occurred during the same broader period of ethical reckoning in American research history that also produced the Belmont Report of 1979, a foundational document that established the core ethical principles, including informed consent, still required of virtually all human research conducted in the United States today, whether in psychology, medicine, or any other field involving human participants. Modern sleep and memory researchers, including those responsible for every legitimate study discussed throughout tonight's episode, operate under research ethics frameworks and institutional oversight boards specifically developed, in significant part, as a direct response to historical abuses like those uncovered during the MKUltra investigation, meaning the very ethical safeguards that make it impossible for a modern researcher to secretly test suggestion techniques on unwitting sleeping participants without their knowledge trace their origin directly back to the public reckoning with exactly this kind of historical program. Rather than focusing on external attempts to influence a sleeping mind, it's worth spending a moment on what the sleeping mind reveals entirely on its own, without any outside cue or suggestion required at all, offering genuine insight into unconscious mental activity through phenomena researchers have studied for decades. Sleep talking, medically termed somniloquy, occurs across a genuinely wide range of sleep stages, and researchers studying it have found that its content, while often fragmented, nonsensical, or difficult to interpret meaningfully, does appear connected in some documented cases to a person's recent waking experiences, emotional preoccupations, or ongoing daytime stressors, suggesting sleep talking may offer a kind of unfiltered, if disorganized, window into whatever content the sleeping brain happens to be actively processing at that particular moment. Researchers have also studied the hypnic jerk, the sudden, involuntary muscle twitch many people experience while drifting off to sleep, often accompanied by a brief, vivid sensation of falling. While the precise cause remains an area of ongoing scientific investigation, one leading theory suggests this reflex may represent an evolutionary holdover from a period in human ancestry when relaxing completely while resting in trees carried genuine physical danger, with the sudden muscle contraction potentially serving as a protective, if now largely unnecessary, reflexive response to the sensation of muscular relaxation itself. Neither of these phenomena involve any kind of external suggestion or influence at all, existing instead as genuinely spontaneous expressions of the sleeping brain's own internal activity, and researchers studying them emphasize that they offer a considerably more reliable, scientifically grounded window into what a sleeping mind is actually doing moment to moment than any of the popular myths about hidden messages or subliminal programming discussed earlier tonight ever could. Researchers studying sleep talking have identified some genuinely interesting patterns in when and how often it tends to occur across a person's life, adding further nuance to our understanding of this common but still only partially understood phenomenon. Sleep talking appears considerably more common in children than adults, with studies estimating that roughly half of all children experience it at least occasionally, a rate that drops substantially, though doesn't disappear entirely, by adulthood. It also appears more likely to occur during periods of illness, fever, sleep deprivation, or significant emotional stress, findings consistent with the broader idea that sleep talking may reflect, at least in part, ongoing unconscious processing of a person's current physical and emotional state rather than representing entirely random, meaningless vocal noise. Researchers studying the specific content of recorded sleep talk episodes have also found that a surprisingly large proportion of it takes the form of questions, exclamations, or expressions of negative emotion like frustration or protest, more often than calm, neutral statements. An intriguing pattern some researchers have connected to the fact that sleep talking occurs more frequently during dream-related sleep stages and lighter stages of sleep associated with more active, unresolved mental processing than during the very deepest, most restorative stages of slow-wave sleep. The hypnic jerk deserves a bit more attention as well, since it represents one of the most universally experienced yet still only partially understood phenomena in all of sleep science, something the overwhelming majority of people have felt firsthand yet rarely think to ask about further. Beyond the evolutionary falling reflex theory mentioned earlier, some researchers have proposed alternative or complementary explanations, including the possibility that the sudden muscle jerk reflects a kind of misfiring in the brain's normal, gradual transition process between wakefulness and sleep. Essentially a brief miscommunication as different brain regions shift into their sleep-associated activity patterns at slightly different rates, producing a momentary, harmless glitch in the handoff. Researchers have also found that hypnic jerks appear to occur more frequently during periods of stress, sleep deprivation, or excessive caffeine consumption, offering a genuinely practical, evidence-based piece of guidance for anyone who experiences them frequently enough to find them disruptive to falling asleep, since addressing these underlying contributing factors, rather than the jerks themselves directly, tends to be the more effective, better supported approach according to sleep specialists who study this common, if still not fully explained, nightly phenomenon. We close tonight's exploration with the practical question worth carrying forward from everything we've covered. Given what genuine, rigorous science actually supports, rather than what popular mythology has long promised, what can a person realistically, safely do to work constructively with their own sleeping mind, rather than against it? The clearest, most consistently supported finding across tonight's entire episode is this: sleep does not create new understanding out of nothing, but it appears genuinely, measurably excellent at reinforcing and consolidating understanding that has already been actively, consciously established beforehand while fully awake. This means the most evidence-supported practical approach available isn't playing recordings of brand new information you hope to somehow absorb while unconscious, but rather ensuring genuine, focused, conscious engagement with material you want to remember or reinforce during your waking hours, ideally followed by a full, uninterrupted night of quality sleep shortly afterward, allowing your brain's own natural, already well-documented consolidation processes to do their genuine work without needing any artificial technological assistance at all. For those specifically interested in exploring the more experimental territory of targeted memory reactivation, researchers note that consistently, deliberately pairing a particular, distinctive scent or sound with material you're actively studying while awake, then gently reintroducing that same specific cue in your sleep environment afterward, represents one of the few sleep-related memory techniques with genuine, published scientific support behind it, though even here, researchers emphasize this functions as a modest reinforcement tool working alongside real waking effort, never as any kind of replacement for the actual work of learning itself. And for the simple, honest desire many people carry to feel calmer, more positive, or gently reassured heading into sleep each night, tonight's research suggests there's nothing at all wrong with listening to soft, soothing words or calming affirmations during that drowsy window just before genuine sleep fully arrives, so long as that practice is understood honestly, as a genuine, real form of conscious relaxation and gentle self-directed suggestion, rather than mistaken for some form of secret unconscious mind control operating entirely outside your own awareness while you rest. There is one final, practical distillation worth offering, drawn directly from everything tonight's episode has carefully established, that captures the genuine, evidence-based relationship between sleep and influence in a single, memorable idea. Sleep is not a blank slate waiting to be written on by whatever recording happens to be playing nearby, and it is not a locked vault entirely sealed off from the outside world either. It is closer to a careful, discerning editor, one that reviews the material you've already actively gathered and consciously engaged with during your waking hours, decides what genuinely deserves to be kept, strengthened, and carried forward, and quietly, protectively declines to simply accept whatever new, unvetted material happens to arrive while you're not there, consciously present, to properly evaluate it yourself. Working with that editor productively was never really about finding some clever trick to sneak information past it while it sleeps. It was always, simply, about doing the genuine work of learning and reflection while fully awake, and then trusting your sleeping mind to do the careful, quietly sophisticated work it already knows how to do with whatever you've honestly given it. Tonight we walked carefully through one of the most persistently mythologized corners of sleep science, separating a century of genuinely fascinating, real research from an equally long history of exaggerated, and sometimes entirely fabricated, popular claims. We learned why the classic mid-century dream of sleep learning almost entirely failed under proper scientific scrutiny, and why a sleeping brain's resistance to absorbing brand new information may actually protect, rather than limit, the delicate work of memory consolidation already underway. We discovered the genuine, more modest reality of targeted memory reactivation, a real technique capable of gently reinforcing memories, habits, and even fear responses that have already been established while awake, and we trace subliminal messaging back to its origins in a now thoroughly debunked publicity stunt, distinguishing it clearly from the real, if considerably smaller, phenomenon of psychological priming. We looked honestly at the genuinely documented, if ultimately unsuccessful, history of government research into sleep and suggestion, and we considered what the sleeping mind reveals entirely on its own, through sleep talk and hypnic jerks, without needing any outside influence at all. None of what we uncovered tonight was meant to leave you feeling as though your own mind is either mysteriously vulnerable or, conversely, entirely closed off and unreachable while you rest. The genuine truth, as it so often is in careful science, sits somewhere gentler and more nuanced in between, a sleeping mind that remains quietly, selectively engaged with its surroundings, capable of reinforcing what you've already built through real, conscious effort, but never simply, secretly rewritten by a hidden voice in the dark. There is a certain kind of relief available in this more measured, evidence-based picture, one perhaps worth sitting with as tonight's episode comes to its close. So much of the popular mythology around sleep and hidden influence, however thrilling, ultimately positions the sleeping mind as something passive and at risk, waiting to be shaped by whatever clever technique someone else manages to smuggle past its defenses. What genuine science actually reveals is considerably more dignified than that. Your sleeping mind is not a vulnerability to be guarded against. It is a quiet, careful collaborator, working faithfully through the night on behalf of whatever real, honest effort you gave it during the day, asking nothing more mysterious of you than that you show up, awake and attentive, for the parts of learning and growth that were always going to require you there in the first place. If tonight's journey through the real science of sleep and suggestion was worth your time, a like, a subscribe, or a thought left below helps the Sleep Lab stay open for the next curious, sleepy mind who finds their way here. And if you're still awake, there's another story waiting just beyond this one, whenever you're ready for it. But for now, let your thoughts settle exactly as they are, without needing to be reshaped, reprogrammed, or influenced by anything at all beyond your own quiet, natural drift into rest. Sleep well. And good night.